What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over some more advanced blocking logic. So this is pretty much going to be the end of the blocking logic. We can potentially add things to it in the future, such as breaking out of combos by pressing buttons while you're blocking and a pushback. But that is a separate mechanic entirely. As for actual blocking mechanics, both automatic and manual, so backing away from your opponent and also holding a manual block button, should be done after this episode. The main thing we're going to address in today's episode is an issue where if the player collides with a proximity box, but not the strike hitbox, they go into a blocking state and can never exit. This is because the player that is attacked and is attempting to block gets hit by the proximity box, and so they get told to go into the blocking state. However, when the attack is done, if the strike hitbox does not land, we never go into any of the logic to end stun or to do anything related to that, really. So we just sit there where we're at. So let me show you an example. I can attack with this player. Okay, if I manually block, you can see that I'm not taking damage, and I can release the button, and everything is good. If I go to automatically block, I have to be backing away from my opponent. So let's say we back away. See how I went into the blocking pose, but I did not take damage? That's because I got hit by the proximity box that triggered a block, but I did not get hit by the strike box. Now, I've exaggerated the proximity box a little bit, so if we are to play this again and go into the practice mode, I can actually show you what the hitbox looks like. And this will probably make a little bit more sense. So say we skip all of our stuff, okay? So here's what we've got. Now, the basic attack, it's quick, okay? It just flashes them on screen. And I just kind of arbitrarily put these boxes here, so don't worry too much about their placement. But you can see that there's a proximity box. That's the yellow box, and it spans a greater distance than the strike box. So if I am to manually block within this range, the proximity box collides, but no damage occurs as expected. However, if I am to back away and collide with the proximity box, I go into the blocking state. You can see that this does still go away now, and the character returns to the idle position afterward. This is the intended behavior. Before, they would not return to idle, so you would just get stuck. I'll demonstrate. Basically, I'd be backing away, I'd go into the block state, and then I would sit like this. And the character would be unable to move until they were hit again and knocked out of that state. So we're going to be fixing that issue up today, as well as some general fixes to the proximity boxes. We're also going to be fixing some things with hit reactions when either going into the crouching state, like the crouching hit reaction, or the crouch block. So we'll be covering all those things today, and this will wrap up our blocking, crouch blocking, manual, and automatic all together. We should not have to modify these further unless we want different functionality or to expand upon it. But our actual blocking logic should be solid after today. Alright, so to get started, if you want to get caught up in the series, I believe this is episode 142 or 143 of the fighting game tutorial series, so we're very far along. Very, very happy with all the progress we've made in this series so far, but we still have a lot to do. If you want to get caught up and check out everything we've got going on in the series, you can click this playlist in the top right corner right here and check out every episode, every tutorial that got us to this point. Alternatively, if you just want to check out content related to blocking, I'll link you to the first episode of blocking right here in this iCard in the top right corner. Alright, and otherwise we can go ahead and get started on today's episode. So we're going to start in the code today because we have to make a change to a function. Specifically, the function that gets called when we get hit with a proximity box. So I'm going to go to my fighter template character.h, or my base character. I'm going to scroll down and find the collided with proximity box or hitbox function, whatever you called it. I actually don't know where it's at in here because this is getting bigger and bigger, so I'd recommend searching unless you know, because it's super simple. You press Control F and type in what you want. So we can hit collide, we can type collided with proximity, and it should come up by then. Collided with proximity hitbox. So this is the function we call when a proximity hitbox collides with our player's hurtbox, or our character's hurtbox. And before, we had no parameter in here. So I'm adding a parameter in here called block stun frames. This is very similar to how we use it in our take damage function. intake damage right here, you can see we have block stun frames as a parameter. And this is because when we take damage, if we're in the blocking state, we can still take chip damage, right? So we can still take damage, but then we'll have these block stun frames that we have to wait until we can act again. And we want that same sort of behavior with the proximity hitbox. This is because if the proximity hitbox triggers a block, then we want to make sure that we go into that block stun. You can get hit by the proximity hitbox and not be attempting to block, and thus you won't get stunned. All right, so quick demo one more time. Just know, I should go into practice, but you can see that the proximity hitbox should be hitting anywhere around here. And the player's not getting stunned. They're not getting these block stun frames. They can still act. The character can still do whatever it is they need to do. So it's only if you're trying to go into the block state that you'll get those block stun frames. So you don't have to worry about that interrupting any other logic. We're going to make sure we're going to go into the block state before utilizing the block stun frames. However, the reason we do this is because if we do trigger the block because we're anticipating attack, but we miss the strike box, we still need to be able to return to idle after. So even if we never have any sort of collision and add the block stun frames, we're just going to sit there at 0. Now, instead of doing this, if you'd like, you could just force the character to go from block back to idle if the collision with the hitbox was the proximity hitbox and block stun frames were never added. You could do a check, make sure your block stun frames were above 0, and if they are, leave them in the block state, and if they're not, return to idle, which would allow them to return to idle immediately. However, in some games, when you do get hit with the proximity box, you'll automatically trigger that blocking state. That's why I'm doing this here, is because we're triggering the blocking state. So at this point, we were anticipating a block, we just dodged it. I still want to have some amount of frames that is going to force me to stay in that blocking state before I can continue and go about my normal game. Alright, so nothing else about this function is changing and nothing else in this class is changing. We're going to go into the CPP file. And I'm going to scroll down. I know where it is because I have it edited here, but find your collided with proximity hitbox function. And we're going to add the int block stun frames here into the parameter list. And now what we have is in here, we were checking to see if we were pressing backward, which is a Boolean that is determined in the move right functions based on the direction we're facing and the inputs we are holding. So this is something we covered a long time ago, and we did this for the automatic blocking in the first place. So if we are pressing backward, then we go ahead and print out this log to say we are preparing to block an attack by pressing the opposite direction of the opponent, and we were calling start automatically blocking. These two new things that I've done are completely different. We have not done these yet. And so what this is this is just the logic to stun the character at this point, to essentially trigger the block stun. So we have num stun frames, which every tick, which is every frame, we'll go through, check the number of stun frames that we have right here, decrement from it, and once it is less than or equal to 0, we end the stun. So if we set the number of stun frames to be the block stun frames that are passed in, we're essentially stunning the character for that number of frames. And then I call begin stun, which stops the character from being able to do things like move. If we look at begin stun, it's actually very simple. I don't have a lot in here right now. I just check and see if the num stun frames is above 0, and if it is, we set can move to be false. I do these two things additional in the collide with proximity hitbox function. But it's pretty simple in terms of what it actually is. Now, you should actually do this for projectiles as well if you have proximity hitboxes on them. We do allow the projectile hitboxes to be automatically blocked. However, I'm actually using the projectile hitbox as really just one hitbox at the moment. It's basically just a strike hitbox that moves with the projectile. So it's not required that you actually do this here because those projectiles will have those number of frames on them. Whereas we have to add block stun frames to the proximity hitboxes if we're going to use this method. So you have a little bit of freedom here how you want to do this, but if you're using proximity boxes on your projectile hitboxes as well, then you need to make sure that you have this logic in the corresponding function, and make sure you add the int block stun frames to the CPP and to the header, just like we did in the function above it. Okay, and one other thing we should look at is the end stun function. So we already showed off begin stun. Here's end stun. This logic is not changing. It is still good as I showed it off in the previous episode. But just a quick recap, we have logic for if we're manually blocking and if we're not manually blocking. So this should cover all your needs for end stun. But just make sure that yours looks like mine and has the same sort of checks, or does whatever you need to do if yours is different than mine. That's perfectly fine. But basically, just recap this. Make sure your end stun still looks good for this logic that we want today, because we do want to make sure this is going to be what sets our state back to the default or the crouching instead of the crouch blocking or the standard blocking once the block stun frames are out. Okay. With all that code done, we can go back into the editor. There's a few things we're going to change today. So let's go into our hitbox data table if you have that. Otherwise, you might just have it in your anim BP. So let me go over the data table first. So I have mutant hitbox data, and this has all my hitboxes, and I choose which ones to spawn based on anim notifies or other factors on my character and the animation they're playing. So I have hitbox 1, which is almost always a proximity, and then hitbox 2, which is a strike. So you can see that the hitbox type says proximity. For the hitboxes that have proximity, I want to make sure that they have at least one block stun frame if I'm using the method shown in today's episode. This way we can set block stun frames and then they can be reset afterward. The main thing we have to worry about here is that our proximity boxes should then all have block stun frames. So you can make them as small as 1 frame. So after 1 frame it will revert. If not hit by the strike hitbox, of course, if it's hit by the strike hitbox, then it's going to take those block stun frames. You could make them the same as the strike hitbox, or however you want, really. We have some special ones in here, like my special attack is that mutant combo punch that he does. That move doesn't have any hit stun or block stun frames because it's more of like a cinematic attack. It doesn't need to have these specific values on here because the enemy character can't break out of it regardless. So I didn't put this on. I actually just assigned this data to be 0 and then use this data here, these hitboxes, as data for location, size, that sort of thing. But go through all your hitboxes and set them as needed. Here's my fireball projectile hitbox. You'll notice I haven't set up everything for it. This is just because I'm lazy, so I should apply the damage as I want. I should also add the hit stun frames and block stun frames directly on this hitbox. Just like that. And I can do this for all my moves, set them up how you want them, and you'll be good. Anyway, once your moves have block stun frames, we'll be able to continue with the next part of the tutorial. If you don't have a data table, that is actually okay. For some of this, I have been lazy so far, and I have not actually finished all my attacks. So you'll notice some of my attacks and my anim notifies use the data table, and some are actually just manual calls to this function with random data passed into it. If you have swapped all yours over, great, you'll be using the data table. If you haven't, that's also fine because you can just simply plug in the data you want here. Just make sure your proximity boxes have block stun frames. Now this is important because here in the active hitboxes, okay, this is my rifle punch, this is my standard light attack that I was using there. I'm already passing block stun frames into the create active hitbox and have been for many episodes now. However, I have all the way up here, I have the started anim notifies, which are where the proximity hitboxes are spawned. And once they're spawned, they have all this data that gets passed into them, like the create active hitboxes. However, they were all the same, again, mainly because I was being lazy. And so if you were doing it like I was, you need to either assign a default block stun frame amount on these proximity boxes, or you need to actually do this logic here, just like we did for the other ones, where we use the data table row, break the hitbox data, and pass it into the function. This is the more appropriate method. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to do it at least with this example today, but you can set it up however you want. It's not a problem. Just make sure that you are aware of it. So I'll leave this one over the side so we can show you the differences. So this was the old method. Okay. So quick note on this. This is rifle punch start. If we look for that anim notify, that's going to be in our rifle punch. It's going to be this anim notify right here. This is where I spawn the proximity hitbox. This is where where I want to spawn the proximity hitbox. So right at this stage in the attack. So once this anim notify fires, which means we've reached that point in the animation, we're going to do two simple nodes, and then call the create proximity hitbox function. So we're going to call get data table row right here. You're going to have to pass it a data table. Now, we don't have to be fancy. We can just select it from the list because we know if we're in the mutant anim BP, we're always going to grab the mutant hitbox data for this. The row name is going to be the proximity hitbox that we want to use. For me, it is light attack hitbox 1, but it could be any of yours. Just make sure you're on the one that we set up in the data table. That way you have that row and you have its information. You drag off the out row and type break hitbox data, or select the break hitbox data here, either way. And then you can have this huge drop down list, which I'm going to bring this up above. And you have all these different things you can set on them. Okay. Now, what I did was I went to call the create proximity hitbox, and we don't have a block stun frames at this section. I've added this for today's episode, but at this point, you will not have this, so we'll have to go ahead and add this. So click into the create proximity hitbox, or click on it, and make sure to add a new input parameter by clicking the plus, and call it block stun frames, and it should be an integer because we track our frames in integers. I put it above the transform, which we already had the transform, just because I thought it looked better and because it was more consistent. If I click on my create active hitbox, block stun frames is also above the transform. But it's not required that you do that. You just need to make sure that you have block stun frames in here as an integer. You can put it wherever you want in this function. Then I take the break and pass everything into the create proximity hitbox. So I pass in the type, which is proximity, the location, rotation, and scale, and then the block stun frames. Now, you can also click hide unconnected pins if you'd like. It will get rid of any pins that are not connected to something else, and I'll just hide them. You can always show them again. So if I click hide unconnected pins, you'll get something like this. However, you saw that it actually took out hitbox transform because the transform is one variable, and I had to split it to get the others. So be aware of that. If you do that, you might have to re-enable that one. But just make sure that you have everything connected here, and you'll have this nice little node that tracks the data table information and passes it along to the proximity hitbox we're about to create. Now, with this in place, we can go into the create proximity hitbox and determine what we should do with the block stun frames. So create proximity hitbox is essentially the exact same as I have left it. I showed this off in a previous episode where we used the members and we set the members in the hitbox data structure. And that was the last thing we did with it. Other than that, I cleaned it up a little bit by spacing things out a little bit so they're not directly on top of each other and adding some more reroute nodes, but the rest of the function is the same and it should match what you already have. There's one new thing we're going to add now, which is what to do with this variable. So Like all the other parameters in our hitboxes and our create hitbox functions, we just want to pass the data along to the hitbox that we spawn. So we spawn hitbox actor right here. We're going to set its type, its location, rotation, and scale. And we're also going to set the block stun frames. So the set members you may already have in here if you've been following the series, but if you don't, it's okay. Really, really simply how you get this is this hitbox actor BP. Let's go into that real quick. Hitbox actor BP is the hitbox that we spawn, and it is going to have a structure called hitbox data. Hitbox data is all the information. It's a code structure that we made that has all the information of the hitbox that we can pass along to it. So my hitbox actor.h, if I scroll down, you can see I have this hitbox type, hitbox height, hitbox transform, whatever. It's all part of this f hitbox data structure. And then at the very end, we have this hitbox data structure. We have a variable of that we can grab. That way we know exactly what we have in our hitbox data. So I grab this structure and I just drag off of it and type set members. Again, you probably already have this, but if you don't, that's how you can get it. From here, once you set members, you'll be able to set every single variable that is in that structure. Make sure you click on the set members box and include the ones you want as pins. That way you can set them. So block stun frames was hidden for me, so it looked like this before. Make sure you click on it, select block stun frames, and then you manually want to pass in the block stun frames that come from the parameter list of the function. The rest of this you can actually leave alone. You don't have to worry about it. And we can go into our hitbox actor BP. Okay, so everything here is the same. The projectile logic is the same. The begin play is the same. This is old logic. This is now what I have for my check collision event. So, in check collision, I get overlapping actors and I search specifically for the fighter template character class because that is all we're checking collision against right now. If we don't find anything here, we could hit other things like stages or projectiles and that sort of data. But we don't have anything for that now, so it's perfectly fine. We can type get overlapping actors, and then you just select the type you want, which I already said is our base character class. From here, I do a for each loop, and I make sure that the fighter template character that we found is not equal to exclamation mark equal or just not equal object the owner of this hitbox. Now the owner is set in the anim BP, so right after we spawned that proximity hitbox, it has its owner set to the owner of this anim BP, or basically the mutant character. And so we don't want to be able to hurt ourselves, so we get the owner and make sure it's not equal to the fighter template character that we're overlapping with. Okay, if we go into this branch and it's true that it's not equal to that, that means we've collided with a different fighter template character. So at this point, we can cast the array element, fighter template character, so we can grab variables on it. I'm just following along with my logic below, showing you how I got it. Now, we need to know if we're using complex hurt boxes or not. This is something I set up in the series a while ago. And so we have two types of hurt boxes: our simple hurt boxes, which is what we're using now, and what I call complex hurt boxes, which can be other shapes than squares and cubes, but it can actually be like circular shapes, spheres, it could be triangles, whatever it is we want to use. So we need to get that variable. I have that variable set up in the game mode. In the begin play, I get the game instance to get a ref, and I get the game mode to get a ref. Okay, so I get two references in here, so I can use the game mode and the game instance. Alright, so now at this point, I just get my game mode reference, and I convert it to a validated get, because we're going to use it to check for this boolean. Before, this is the old logic, Before, we were separating it based on the player we were, using the base game mode reference to get the complex hurt boxes and check specifically for player 1, player 2. It's too much extra. We don't need all this extra. You see it here. Okay, we're making it simpler now. So we have our base game mode reference, and we're going to drag off of it, and we're going to grab our is using complex hurt boxes. From here, we split. Okay, if we are, we go into our check complex collision. If we're not, we go into our check simple collision. Now this has already, all this logic actually already has existed. But see how we're not separating the logic based on player 1 or player 2? This is better anyway, because now we can support tag fights. Instead of just checking for if a hitbox collide with one player or the other player, we can check if it collide with any player of this given class. Alright, so this is what we've got so far. We call check complex collision and check simple collision. These two functions I have not changed since we made them. You're more than welcome to view them again. Here, make sure everything matches or works based on your behavior, your logic that you want. Okay. Those are all the same. Now, they return a Boolean. It says, has collision occurred? And I do a branch off each of those. And if a collision has occurred, then we go into the switch and we grab the hitbox data information. And the way we get this node, remember I said we have this hitbox data structure and we were setting members in it. If we search hitbox data, we can get it here. You can right click on the little actual connector part of the node here and hit split struct bin and you'll get what you see here. Now I want to pass all my data along to the take damage and the collide with proximity hitbox where we need them. So I do a switch on the hitbox enum for the type, just like we were doing in the previous logic for it. Okay, it's the same logic for it. But instead of doing it two places, we're doing it condensed in one place. Okay. Then if it's proximity, it goes up and calls collide with proximity hitbox. This will now have a blocks then frames that will say 0. We'll pass that in a second. If it's strike, we call take damage and pass in all the take damage variables. If it's throw, we list that the player has landed a throw, the other player. And if it's projectile, I'm doing the same thing as the strike. Alright, so you guys have seen this before. I don't have to go over it all again, but just because I'm changing the function and cleaning it up a bit, I wanted to show you. So proximity goes into collide with proximity hitbox, and it takes in the target, which is the casted character that we did earlier in the function. It also takes in a block stun frames, which comes from the hitbox data block stun frames. Okay. Now take damage takes in almost everything. It's going to take in the damage, the hit stun frames, the block stun frames, the pushback and launch amounts, the height of the hitbox, or basically high, mid, / overhead, or low, the location of the hit, and if it should cause hard knockdown or not. Now, should cause ground bounce, I'm actually putting separate. I'm just setting it on the character. Because if the hitbox should cause ground bounce, then I'm telling the character that they should ground bounce. This could also be added to take damage, but we just never did it, and I didn't want to change more things in this episode and make it more confusing. But change it as you see fit. Now I have this nice, much better function, much cleaner, easier to edit. Perfect. The important part about this is that collide with proximity hitbox now takes in a block stun frames. And so now block stun frames will be passed from the data table to the anim BP, to the hitbox, to the collide with proximity hitbox. At which point we will be able to go into our game and block, automatically block based off backing away from a proximity hitbox and either get blocks done and then take the damage, the chip damage during a block, or we can actually miss the actual strike box and avoid the damage, but then also still return back to our idle and default state. Alright, there's one other thing I'd like to talk about in today's episode, and it's just cleaning up a few things with our hit reaction, crouch hit reaction, that sort of thing. So, idle to hit reaction looks like this. If the combo state is low, mid, or high, we can enter the hit reaction rule. And when we do that, we go into the hit reaction state, which we set up to be different based on the number of stun frames, a multiplier, and setting the play rates on each of the corresponding animations. That works, and that's perfect. However, you'll notice that that's a little bit different than how we do our crouch hit reaction. And our crouch hit reaction right now is actually a little bit bugged. So if we go from idle to crouch, we enter this little mini state machine of the crouching states. So we have crouch here, and we have crouch to crouch hit reaction. Has the same transition rule, so that's good. But when we go into the crouch hit reaction state, we were actually setting the play rate basis in the past. The problem with this is it can actually get stuck at the final frame and not progress any further, so you'll just be stuck in your crouch hit reaction state because the number of stun frames was just going straight into this. And if this is 0 before this animation ends and exits out, then it's actually going to just be stuck and not exit out. So we need to do two things here. One, I'm giving it a multiplier just to change the play rate because I don't want to speed it up. I want it to be 1/10 of this. This multiplier doesn't really make sense here because it's actually the opposite of what we want to do, but it's just showing that we can change it based on the stun frames. We have some more things to do with our animations in the future that's going to clean this up, so don't worry about it, just as long as we have some sort of multiplier in here to tell that it is changing and that we can get different results on our animation because of it. If you were like me before and used the play rate basis instead of the play rate, all you do is you click on the animation node, and then you can choose expose on play rate and turn off the expose on play rate basis, and it should look like this bottom line here. So I'm going to get rid of this top section, and now this is what my crouch hit reaction looks like. Another thing that should be done is we should mimic the hit reaction back to idle state. So hit reaction back to idle. That's this right here, hit reaction to idle. The standing hit reaction to idle is just checking to see if there is a combo state, and if there's not a combo state, that means we're good to return to idle. It is not automatic rule based on sequence player and state. You can see this is false. However, in the crouch hit reaction back to crouch, it actually was automatic rule based. Okay, so what you're going to want to do is make this the same transition rule where we check to make sure combo state is none before going back to the standard crouching state. And you also have to make sure that you disable the automatic rule based. If you don't disable this, especially with that, the play rate being able to be so low or be 0, it's not going to hit this potentially ever. And so you want to make sure that automatic rule based is not checked, but instead we have a manual way to exit out of it. Alright guys, and with that said, our blocking is all set up and good to go. We fixed up all known issues with it. And we can go ahead and continue on with our lives and our combat flow without having these issues lingering over us, as well as some advanced blocking, advanced collision logic with our hitboxes. All very convenient stuff. Anyway guys, that's all I got for you today, so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do. I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. Thank you guys for all the love and support, for everything that you do. I'm excited to work on these series and these videos week after week, and I'm glad you guys are excited to see them as well. So thank you so much for all that encouragement and love. I really appreciate it. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I would be happy to assist you and get you set up for anything that you need to help you continue on with your project like I said, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.